Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. We are going to give it just a couple minutes for folks to log on, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are going to give it just one more minute for folks to log on, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks so much for your patience. All right, let's go ahead and jump in and get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our call today. I'm Kim Johnson, Policy Manager with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And in Sarah's absence, I will be hosting NLAHC's House campaign calls when Diane is unable to. So very excited to join you all here today. We have a great lineup for you today. We are going to be joined by NLHC's Vice President of Research, Andrew Arend, who will cover findings from NLHC's recently released report, Out of Reach, which looks at the growing gap between the cost of housing and what people are paid. We'll also be joined by Gina Paladanino, who will talk about the increased burdensome work requirements on SNAP that were put in place as a result of the debt ceiling deal. And their implications for people experiencing homelessness. We'll be joined by Stephanie Watkins-Cruz from the North Carolina Housing Coalition and Christine Hess and Brooke Page from the Nevada Housing Coalition for our field updates. And then we'll close out with a policy update on the FY24 appropriations process. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. And please do remember to post your questions into the chat. Thanks all for saying hello in the chat. Love to see that. And please post your questions in the Q&A. All right, let's get started. I'll start out by handing it over to my colleague, Andrew Arend, who is our Senior Vice President for Research at NLAHC. Andrew, take it away.
Great, thanks, Kim. And I'm glad all of you could join us this afternoon. I'm gonna take a couple of minutes and talk about our annual report, Out of Reach, which we released last Wednesday. And if you can go to the next slide, Out of Reach, for those who don't know, is designed really to answer a question that's on the next slide. How much must a full-time worker earn to afford an apartment in their area? And specifically, how much do they have to earn to afford rent and utilities at the fair market rent in their area? And then we compare that housing wage, what we call the housing wage, to what workers actually earn. And before I get to the findings, I just want to explain a couple of things about how we come up with these numbers. And one is, first, we follow a common assumption that's, of course, applied in many of our federal housing programs, that rent and utilities should not exceed 30% of a household's income. Second, we base our rental costs on HUD's fair market rent, which is what HUD estimates a family that's moving today could expect to pay for rent and utilities for a modest apartment in their area. And from those two things, we calculate the housing wage, which is the hourly wage that a full-time worker would need to earn to afford an apartment or rental home at HUD's fair market rent without spending more than 30% of their income. And the other thing I want to mention before I get into the findings today is just, discuss a little bit about the context of the timing of this report, or what it's following, and in terms of the rental market. And as you all know, 2021 and into 2022, we saw rapid increases in rents across the country. In fact, between January of 2021 and June of 2022, over those 18 months, rents increased nationally by at least 25%. So significant increases. And fortunately, since then, we have seen rent stabilize to the point now where year-to-year increases in rent are around or below 2%. so they're pre-pandemic levels. But that does not mean rents are coming down. They're still very high and very much out of reach for many people. And some of the findings, if we can go to the next slide, I'll give an overview of national findings first, is that as we find that on average, the average housing wage for 2-bedroom apartments today is $28.58, meaning a full-time worker needs to earn more than $28 an hour to afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment. And they would have to earn $23.67 an hour to afford a modest 1-bedroom apartment. And I'm gonna go a little bit further in a minute, but I do want to mention right off the bat that we do have state and local data. We can find data for any county at our website, which is nlihc.org/OOR. And then if you can go to the next slide, as you all know, rental costs vary quite a bit across the country. And this is a state map of the average 2-bedroom housing wage. The dark blue states are the most expensive states in the country, the 5 most expensive being California, Hawaii, Massachusetts, New York. Those 4 states, someone has to earn more than $40. A full-time worker has to earn more than $40 an hour to afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment. And the 5th most expensive is Washington State, where someone has to work more than $36 or has to earn more than $36 an hour. And I do just want to mention that even states that seem to be less expensive, like Arkansas, there is still a significant affordability problem, as states and localities with lower cost housing also tends to have much lower wages and much lower minimum wages. So workers with the lowest wages still struggle to find rental housing that they can afford. And the other thing I want to mention that, of course, all of you know, is that even within a state, we see significant variation in rental costs. And I'm just going to use an example of California, where the 2-bedroom housing wage in Santa Cruz is $61 an hour. And at the same time, there are non-metropolitan counties in the state where the 2-bedroom housing wage is less than $20 an hour. So we see significant variation even within states. On the next slide is a county map of the number of hours that a minimum wage worker would have to work in order to afford a modest 1-bedroom apartment in their county. And we incorporate higher state, the federal minimum wage, but also state and local minimum wages where those minimum wages are higher. And on average, a minimum wage worker needs to work at least 86 hours a week to afford a modest 1-bedroom apartment. And only 7% of counties, that's about, I think, 215 counties out of more than 3,000 counties in the US, and only 7% of counties can a minimum wage worker working full-time afford a 1-bedroom apartment at fair market rent. And we talk quite a bit about minimum wages in our report. But the other thing that we highlight is far more renters than just those working at the minimum wage struggle to afford their rent. And on the next slide, we see a wage distribution graph that you see the distribution of wages. So the lowest 10% of wages, the 10th percentile, is $13.05. The 20th percentile, meaning 20% of wages are below the 20th percentile, $15.60. But as you go up, you can see that the bottom 40% of wages, and nearly or not quite half of all wages, are below the 1-bedroom housing wage, or what is needed by a full-time worker to afford the average fair market rent for a 1-bedroom apartment. So this impacts far more workers than just those at the minimum wage, and can even impact renters who are earning closer to the median wage. And then the next slide shows similarly the wage distribution, but by race, as people of color are disproportionately impacted by the gap between wages and rental costs. If you look at the 3rd bar cluster from the right, you'll see that the median wage, or the 50th percentile for white workers, is adequate for a full-time worker to afford a 1-bedroom rental home. But the median wages for Hispanic workers and Black workers are not adequate. In fact, if you look at the next bar cluster that is second from the right, you'll see that even at the 60th percentile of wages for Black workers and 60th percentile of wages for the Hispanic workers, they are still not adequate for a full-time worker to afford average 1-bedroom apartment at the fair market rent. And then on the next slide, this is a slide of the 13 of the 20 most common occupations in the US that pay median wages that are less than what a full-time worker needs to afford a 2-bedroom at the fair market rent. 10 of those occupations, so 10 of the 20 most common occupations in the US pay a median wage that's less than what's needed to afford a 1-bedroom apartment. And what is striking about this is that those 10 occupations account for about 1/3 of the workforce. And on the next slide are policy solutions, which many of you, are well familiar with on how we solve this problem of the gap between wages and the lack of affordable rental housing. And that is one, is we have to increase federal resources for both the preservation of existing affordable rental housing, and we need to expand the supply of deeply affordable units that would be affordable to renters with the lowest wages and those with the lowest incomes. One of those tools, of course, or one of those programs that we need to increase resources for is the National Housing Trust Fund. We also need to expand rental assistance through the Housing Choice Voucher Program so that we can serve all families who are eligible for rental assistance could actually receive housing assistance or rental assistance. We also need to invest in a National Housing Stabilization Fund that would help renters who experience a sudden, unexpected financial crisis, a short-term crisis, and cannot afford their rent. We saw great success with the emergency rental assistance programs that came out of the pandemic or that were implemented during the pandemic, and we need a program like that that would be more permanent. And then, of course, we also need the strengthened renter protections that would ensure that renters can remain stably housed and that put them on equal footing with landlords as they struggle to pay their rent. And this would include good cause eviction standards, so tenants can't be evicted arbitrarily at the end of their lease, anti-rent gouging legislation that would, for example, prevent gouging after disasters or some other type of market upheaval, and of course, habitability standards. And then I just want to mention that, as I mentioned at the beginning, we provide rental cost data and the housing wage for all metropolitan areas, counties, including rural counties in the report, and also online. And on the next slide, this is the, if you go to our Out of Reach homepage, which is nlihc.org/OOR, this is the page that you would see. And if you were to click on a state on the map and ask for more information, you would be able to obtain data for the state and for counties. And you can also get data for zip codes. If you see below the map, you'll see the question whether you live in a metropolitan area. And then there's a search bar under that. And if you type in a metropolitan area zip code, you would get a housing wage for that zip code, as well as housing wages for surrounding zip codes. And then on the next slide is a screen that you would see if you chose a state. So if you chose, for example, the state of California, you would see a state summary at the top. And then about a quarter of the way down the page, you can select 2 jurisdictions within that state to compare. And the other thing I also want to point out about this page, that there is I have it marked on the slide here, where you can actually download all of the data for the state of California as an Excel file. And I will open it up for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew. We had a few questions come into the chat during the presentation, or to the Q&A during your presentation. So first, question, are there any insights of the role of private equity firms and their impact on affordable housing? And I'm guessing these out of reach numbers.
So in these out of reach numbers, I would say no. We are very concerned about that. But the data we use for out of reach is fair market rents, which are taken, the foundation for them is the American Community Survey. So I don't know how well at the moment what's happening with investors investing in rental housing is being captured by them. But it is a significant concern of ours in some markets.
Definitely, and a really rising issue on the kind of federal policy stage as well. So definitely an issue that we have our eyes on. Another question, how will the cuts coming to HUD in the FY24 budget ostensibly affect the issue of housing affordability?
Well, it's gonna a problem that is very severe and challenging for the lowest wage workers and the lowest income families is going to become a lot worse. It's going to exacerbate a significant problem that we already have. And as Kim and others on our policy team have been pointing out, like the budget cuts will, it's going to harm thousands of families who are relying on rental assistance today. So, you know, the fortunate few who have assistance are at risk. And add that to the many who don't have assistance who, you know, are struggling. So it's a horrible problem. It's going to exacerbate the problem that we've been seeing now for quite some time.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll dive more into the FY24 threats to the FY24 budget in our policy update, but great question and really sets us up for a good discussion later. A question from Carrie, is there comparable data for non-workers such as folks living on SSI or SSDI?
There is. Great. Thank you for that question. In the report, yes, we do include some other data points. And so we include people who are relying on SSI in their state and compare that, what they could afford to pay in rent and compare it to the fair market rent. And then we include a few other examples as well, such as like a family of 3 who's living at the whose income is at the poverty guideline. So we do make some other comparisons too.
Great. And a question, do you have the average percentage of earned income that rent payments take up?
So I don't have it off the top of my head. We don't have it in the report, but you know, when we look at it broken down by income, you know, we know that you know, extremely low income renters on average pay, it's very high. I think it's something more like 80% of their income on rent on average. I think it's around 28 or 29% for all renters. But we don't actually have that in the report.
Yeah, and just for reference for folks who might be curious, our other annual report, The Gap, really goes in depth on cost burden. And so I'll just post a link to that in the chat in case folks are interested. And last question for you, Andrew, and then we will let you go. A really interesting question that we get quite a lot about the intersection of inflation and housing cost. So this question is the rising cost of housing a symptom of inflation or is it something else?
It's both. I think, you know, there's a lot of factors that go into rental costs, and there's a lot of reasons why we've seen rental increases. And, you know, a lot of it is just rent inflation in general. And, you know, in many markets, the supply is starting to catch up with demand, but for quite some time, supply was not keeping up with demand in a number of markets. So we saw an increase for that reason. We saw increases because of inflation in construction costs, materials, and also labor costs. And so there's a variety of reasons. The question of inflation, actually, if I can bring up one other thing that wasn't in my presentation, but that question reminded me of, and I think it's important to point out, is that, you know, we have seen in recent years a significant increase in wages, particularly among low wage workers. In fact, EPI, Economic Policy Institute, has some reports showing that the lowest income workers have seen the most significant increases in the last couple of years. And that's great. But the other thing we have seen in those same years is that rental costs have gone up even more. And so, you know, we do receive comments about, well, wages have gone up, and yes, they have, but they have not kept pace with what we've seen in terms of rental costs going up.
Yeah, and that also, you know, points to the need for greater renter protections against things like rent gouging and displacement and all of those really vital things that we've talked about on these calls before, but that will continue to be a topic of conversation going forward, I think. Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you for sharing your insights, and thank you, of course, for you and all of your work on our annual reports. Always super helpful.
Thanks.
All right, so next we will turn it over to Gina Plato-Nito, who is Deputy Director for SNAP at the Food Research and Action Center. Gina will be talking about the increased burdensome work requirements on SNAP put in place by the debt ceiling deal and their impact on people experiencing homelessness. Gina, thanks so much for joining.
Hi, everyone. Good to see you. Just with the background that we just heard, with rent expenses going so high, I think it's also important to know that with the end of the public health emergency, it's not just that certain population that is going to be affected, but populations across the board. And I'll also mention that at least in our sort of hunger world, we are experiencing something called a hunger cliff. And that's as a result of emergency allotments. There were these emergency allotments, additional SNAP payments that were given to people during the pandemic that stopped for most states in the beginning of March. So we saw people going from $284 a month to about $23 a month. So that caused quite a hunger cliff combined with this public health emergency that if we hadn't had the debt ceiling, what it would have looked like and what is going to look like is that beginning at the end of June, the clock on time limits will begin again. I just want to take a few moments because I know people call it work requirements. And it's important to know that the SNAP program has always had work requirements, okay? People are required to register for work. People are not allowed to quit. People are not allowed to strike. If they're offered employment and training, they need to take it, right? So this is across the board for many individuals. What happens though is that, this is from 18 to 59. What happens though is that in 1996, at the very last minute of negotiations, Congress passed this law that would take these people that they called able-bodied adults without dependents, right? So it was people 18 to 49, which they said, look, we're gonna give you 3 months to look for a job, to interview for a job, and to get a job. And if you can't show that you have a job, and let me rephrase that you are working 20 hours or more or volunteering or meet certain exemptions, then we're gonna cut you off of SNAP benefits. And you can only get SNAP benefits for 3 months in a 3-year period. So I just wanna make that clear that we've always had time limits and that we've always had work requirements, okay? It just means that on top of these work requirements that all SNAP users after age 18 to 59 experience, additional populations, 18 to 49, have time limits, right? Where they must do these things unless they have an exemption to be able to get SNAP. So what happened during the debt ceiling was it made things worse, right? This was an opportunity to say, look, what happened in 1996 was not okay. But what instead happened was that they extended the time limits instead of 49 to 55. Okay, so it increased it by an additional 5 years for individuals. There are some standard legal protections. There are some groups that they said, hey, this won't apply to. And those include, young adults who have aged out of foster care, military veterans, and unhoused populations. While that is important because legal protected rights are always important, it's important to note that our disability community is a perfect example why those exemptions sometimes are not very effective. And I say that because it puts the onus on the person to claim those exemptions. And as it has shown with this particular population, it's incredibly hard sometimes to prove it. So while on its face, these exemptions to say like these groups, which, lawmakers consider to be more worthy than others, it's still incredibly harmful because it's these populations who will have to prove, right? It also increases the amount of work that the state agencies will have to do in order to make sure that people are not incorrectly being kicked out of the program. And it will increase the amount of outreach that will have to be done in explaining this for populations. So I just wanted to flag all of those things and what they mean. So beginning at the end of June 30th, beginning July, the clock begins again, right? So they will count 3 months. So we have July, August, September. So beginning October, many individuals will be cut off. So I know across the board, people have been estimated what the number looks like. We at FRAC, I've not put in a number because it could truly differ because we don't have updated data since FNS, since prior to the pandemic, because many of these people were put on hold because of the public health emergency and because the time barrier that we have put. So we are widely concerned as a whole of what is going to happen beginning in October. I will tell you this, that in 2016, when the nationwide time limits waiver was lifted, over 600,000 individuals lost their SNAP eligibility because they couldn't prove that they were meeting these requirements. And I have to say that one of the biggest issues is that many individuals are working, but it doesn't take into account the commuting time, right? It doesn't take into account folks who live in rural or urban areas where transportation is incredibly difficult. We've heard from individuals who are working 19.5 hours, and for that 0.5 hour are still not eligible for this time limit. We're also dealing with individuals that, because of where they are, a lot of the work is seasonal, so they can't keep constant hours. And there's also many individuals who have hard time tracking the hours that they utilize. One of the exemptions is to volunteer, but as we all know, being able to volunteer, it's a matter of privilege and accessibility. So it's not necessarily a good option for individuals. So what's going to happen is, like I said, starting in July, the clock starts. In October, you're going to start seeing people being kicked off the program. And with the debt limit, that higher population is going to be expanded and is really going to be up to the staff agency and up to you, to whoever works in outreach, to be able to capture individuals. I have to say that my background is a legal services attorney. So I did a lot of waivers with this particular population, and it was incredibly hard, particularly the unhoused. While this is an exemption, I got to tell you that it's going to be incredibly difficult because they're going to have to prove their homelessness. We have to figure out the sort of messaging that the SNAP agencies are going to do. But overall, what will be more equitable will be that across the board, this could be eliminated. I do have action ask, and I would hope that, I don't know how many of you are aware, but this is Farm Bill year, meaning that our SNAP program has the opportunity to be able to be strengthened and protected. So there is currently a bill, it's called HR 1510, that would eliminate these time limits across the board. That would say, look, regardless of where you are in your situation, we're going to make sure that you are not being punished because you can't meet these requirements within 3 months. The last month's labor statistics report showed that individuals, it was taking individuals between 13 to 17 months to be able to find a job and begin working. And yet this rule is saying 3 months to do all of that. So I'll stop there in case you have any questions, and I'll also put my email and I'll put all the talking points about time limits. But if you get anything out of this, I just ask you to call it time limits because that's really what it is. People are already working, and there's many individuals who just can't show that they have enough hours. And I'll put a couple of other resources here on the chat and my email as well if you have any additional questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gina. And thank you also for that important note that these are time limits, not work requirements. Most of the people receiving SNAP benefits are already working. This is just a way of kicking people off so that they no longer have to serve them. Great point. So just a couple questions that have come in during your presentation. One, what can SNAP do to more accurately allow for full housing cost deductions? It would help immensely to be able to deduct the actual cost of housing.
Yes, there's actually a bill. It's called Closing the Meal Gap Act by Representative Alma Adams. And I'll go ahead and put in the chat what our FRAG's Farm Bill priorities, but this is HR 3037. And what it will do is to be able to put the full shelter cost of an individual, because right now only those over 60 and those who have a disability are able to put their full shelter costs. And as the presentation just showed, it is quite a lot of individuals who are not. So I will go ahead and put that, our priorities there so you can see how you can get involved. But apologize, I forgot the number. So HR 3037 is the bill that would be able to count the actual shelter expenses for families.
Awesome. I always mix up, there's so many bill numbers and everything, but great. That is super helpful to know. Just a clarifying question, is the 3 month time limit that you're referring to looking at and finding a job or something else?
No, 3 month time limit is saying, look, if you are now so the current ones is up to you are 49, right? But with the debt ceiling, now it's up to your 55. And if Republicans have their way with what they did in appropriations, it will be up to your 56, okay? So right now it's up to 55, okay? So what it does is that, look, you have to show that you're meeting one of these exemptions or one of these requirements. If not, you can only get SNAP for 3 months in a 3-year period. Right? So it doesn't count that you're looking for a job. It's not like unemployment where every week you will say, yes, I look for a job, I interview, and I can keep getting unemployment after this certain period. No, they don't count any work, any interviews. They just count whether or not you're working an additional at least 20 hours a week.
Super helpful clarification. Thank you, Gina. And then just a couple more questions. Do you know what definition of homeless is being used, and do states have flexibility to create a broad definition?
That's an excellent question. We're actually working with FNS to see which definition they're going to utilize. I'll put it in the chat. But I will say that states really have a lot of ability to be able to work with their own SNAP agency to figure out what will be able to work for them. So there could be a lot of administrative fixes that you could do that are a little bit easier to do at a state level than they are at a federal level.
Awesome, super helpful. And just one more question, actually another one just came in. One question, so we've seen, I think I read a report even just yesterday about Medicaid unwinding in Florida and how many people have lost that service, not because they're not eligible, but because of the bureaucratic process that they needed to complete by a certain time that they weren't able to, and now they are losing their health insurance. Do you have any recommendations for how advocates can, help ensure people, and especially people experiencing homelessness, don't find themselves in a similar situation with these SNAP benefits?
Yeah, I mean, the best thing is to try to get them signed up as soon as possible. Try to get a contact number, because unfortunately, it's just not the application, is the reporting, right? And we know that this is a very transient population for good reasons. It's really difficult to keep an address or keep a contact number that is valid. So there really has to be a lot of proactive outreach. There is not one way to do it, and each state and each program is going to do things differently. So the more that they can do now before they get cut off, the more that you can start meeting with them before they cut off, before that October, because you don't want them to lose any benefits, right? You don't want them to be like, oh, you were eligible for this, you got cut off, and let me get you back on. Is keeping them on now, calling at your state agency and say, look, I am an unhoused individual, and making sure that that's on the file for now.
Great.
And I'll also put, I guess, a couple of talking points that we did on like what's the best way of communication and other updates on the chat as well.
Wonderful. That will be so helpful. And then just two more quick questions, and then we'll let you go. So for implementation for the new exemptions for veterans, people experiencing homelessness, former foster youth, is there a way to build on top of those exemptions to make them easier to claim by working with the administration through guidance? Because those new exemptions can be very helpful for making sure people don't lose assistance.
Yeah, I mean, the best solution is to get rid of them as a whole, right? Yeah. To just allow people. And because of that, it's going to take a lot of advocacy, particularly, for veterans, because not all of them were honorably discharged. And then so, those who were dishonorably discharged because don't ask, don't tell. I will say that primarily communities of color, veterans of color, were harmed, right, by dishonorably discharged, and many of them don't believe that they are veterans. So there's a lot of work to do within the veteran community to ensure that they are able to avail themselves. Similarly to youth and foster care, that's going to be a lot of work for this youth to even know that they are eligible and that this is an exemption, and to figure out eligibility. So for those of you, again, I'll put my email, happy to chat. It will take a lot of work if you're already part of a coalition within your state agency that can ask guidance from FNS. The state agencies have a lot of ability to be able to do things with FNS. So, all of these rules, they're the floor, not the ceiling. So your state is able, and it really does differ by state, right? Some states make it a lot more easier than others. And FRAC will be publishing best practices to deal with this population in the upcoming weeks. So happy to share those as well in toolkits and our email to make sure that you can ask us any questions.
Fantastic. Well, we will have to bring you back on when that's published, and we will be happy to keep folks in the loop as opportunities to weigh in on implementation present themselves. So awesome. Thank you so much, Gina. Just a couple more, or just one more question in the chat. If someone is on unemployment, how does that work with their SNAP benefits?
So in order for you to be on SNAP, it depends how they were. Remember, it's the time limits. It depends whether or not they quit the job. It depends under the circumstances, but generally those 3 months apply regardless. And then also remember with SNAP is an income and a deduction. So I know across the board, there seems to be this wrongful idea that a lot of people on SNAP is not necessarily true because the income is so incredibly low for you to be eligible. There's just a lot of need, but I'll put a couple of materials in the chat and then folks can get that information from there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Gina. That was super helpful, and we'll be sure to keep folks updated. Thank you again for all of your work on this important issue, and thank you for joining us today.
Happy to.
Wonderful. So next we are going to turn to our field updates. I'll first be introducing Stephanie Watkins-Cruz, who is the Director of Housing Policy at the North Carolina Housing Coalition. Stephanie, welcome. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me. Like Kim said, my name is Stephanie Watkins-Cruz, the North Carolina Housing Coalition, and just wanted to give you all a few updates on our federal advocacy efforts and kind of some shifts that we've been making in order to refine those efforts a bit. Just for some context, a significant portion of our advocacy is really grounded in information, communications, and helping our coalition members and our network recognize the intersections of policy at the local, state, and federal levels. So if it sounds daunting, it's because it is. But we've been doing a few things to try and both lift up and make more accessible information about federal policy and federal campaigns, while also connecting it to state legislation, state trends, and kind of trying to kind of show why things are so intertwined in our housing ecosystem. So a few things that we've been doing, some of you may know, we do a housing call every Tuesday at 9:45. I pretend to be a podcaster, and we go through an entire sort of extensive notes list kind of deal that involves federal level news, policy news. And at least once or twice a month, we deep dive into that particular campaign, policy, or legislation or resource that we really want to highlight and lift up that really kind of goes towards either protecting renters, advocating for increasing supply of affordable housing, or preserving that affordable housing, or just gives a good data approach to it as well. But we try to break that down and make it really accessible. The call's usually around 15 to 20 minutes at the most. So we've now gone from sort of only having this bulleted list to having a few deep dives and dedicating a good portion of the call to a deep dive. And then we've also included call to actions with each section of the federal policy updates in the call notes that accompany the call. So if folks miss the call, it's recorded. People can listen to it on the way to work another day, or they can simply read all of our notes that were involved in the updates. And so now they'll start seeing that there's always call to actions. And then we make sure to try and time it correctly, where we not only have it within the call notes, but we do separate call to actions either on social media or to a separate email through a newsletter to our members and to folks that have expressed interest. One thing that's been increasingly kind of at the center of our minds is how to integrate advocacy around stability interventions for renters. We are fighting at the state level for a bill that we're really concerned about that would prohibit source of income discrimination from being a policy that local governments can enact, except for the ones that already have it. And that would put a lot of undue unnecessary burdens and even expenses on renters in the event that they're evicted, whether they win or lose the case. And then additional pressures around service animals. And so we're trying to, whenever we have our presentations and any sort of resource sharing, connecting the sort of broader resources around how housing interventions that address renter stability benefit our communities, and kind of interjecting that into our advocacy pieces. We've had a lot of that go to our folks that are in the organizing space, have some op-ed pieces come out of those communities. And then we've also had a few meetings with state legislators around that as well. And again, really trying to keep that system of local, state, and federal, and this is how all of that interconnects, is a narrative we're still refining. We also have done some, advocating around eviction record expungement and talking about why that's really important. Around 60% of the folks that have eviction filings in North Carolina, a lot of those end up either getting settled or, resolved somehow. So if those evictions could be expunged from their records, then that would be an extremely, that'd be a huge benefit to a really already tightening, housing demand situation, and would really be a boost, but we're not there yet. Again, we do a lot of presentations to community organizations. We try and use the HoUSed framework quite a bit, and we use Out of Reach. We've integrated the Out of Reach data into not only into our blogs, but into our county profiles. We do 100 county profiles every year, and we update them. And this most recent year for this year's profiles, we use Out of Reach data for each of our counties and kind of continue driving those national and state and county data points home each time we talk about it or use the county profiles or go to a conference. And then something we've been trying to do more actively, and that's kind of the last two pieces, is promoting all the national campaigns and supporting funding for housing and community development, and mentioning on our calls, because it is a big vehicle of how we communicate and get information across to people, talk about how it impacts them directly and why it matters. So a lot of things going on, a lot of analysis and data and figuring out creative ways to communicate and make more accessible content. And that's what's going on in North Carolina. It has not been a boring legislative session, and it's not even been a boring week. So there's a lot happening. And I think our main priority, challenge, and opportunity is figuring out how to further connect local, state, and federal policy together.
Fantastic. What a great update. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for all of your work that you and your organization are doing in North Carolina. Certainly not a boring legislative session, and the week just started. So already off to a good start, going strong. So just a couple questions for you. So where can people access the advocacy call that you mentioned, in case they're, in North Carolina or just big fans of state policy?
Yeah, sure. So I can put a link to our website in the chat. There is a call-in number. And if you can't call in, you can go on Spotify, and I believe on Apple Podcasts even. It might just be Spotify, and you can look up Housing Matters 2, like the number 2 NC, and you'll have all the recordings. But I like to show people or lead them to our website so that they can have the call recording right there and the full call notes. Because if you're a housing nerd like me, sometimes you get really excited when you hear something and then you want to click on it right away. So in case you want that data at your fingertips, I can link that in the chat, but it's every single Tuesday. You'll either hear my voice or my executive director's voice.
Fantastic. Also cool to be like, oh yeah, I'm on Spotify. Very cool. Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining and for all of the incredible work that you're doing, Stephanie. We will have to have you back on to hear more about what's going on in North Carolina as your, legislative session keeps plugging along.
Thank you so much.
Great. And so our final field update for today, we are going to be joined by Christina Hess and Brooke Page. Christine is the executive director at the Nevada Housing Coalition, and Brooke serves as a Nevada Housing Coalition board member. Thank you both for joining today.
Hi, thank you so much, everyone, and thanks for those updates. I just have to say, I'm so glad we're not in session anymore. So kind of hearing the North Carolina update, we just finished June 5th, but then also had some special sessions with our stadium bill that if you're a baseball fan, you might have followed. So I think we should have some slides, Kim, if we can bring those forward, and I will get started. So as Kim mentioned, my name is Christine Hess, and I am the Executive Director for the Nevada Housing Coalition. We are a partner of the National Low Income Housing Coalition, a proud partner. And we also are our statewide nonprofit to advance and promote affordable housing for all Nevadans. Our group works primarily through education, advocacy, and collaboration. If we go to the next slide, obviously I'm here today to talk about our advocacy work. So I just want to give a highlight before I jump into our legislative session. In 2021, the American Rescue Plan Act passed. And at that time as well, our legislature was meeting. We meet every other year. And they had decided to do outreach in partnership with the executive branch on what we should do with our American Rescue Plan Act funds. It was pretty incredible. I was like, oh my gosh, I think they just asked what the state should do with their over $2 billion in American Rescue Plan Act funds that weren't already committed. So the Nevada Housing Coalition put together a statewide task force virtually and representing, across the spectrum, again, builders, developers, affordable housing developers, advocates, and local governments, just you name it. We had a whole slew of representatives from the housing ecosystem, healthcare, and said, what should we do? We put forward a recommendation, and lo and behold, in 2022, the governor announced a $500 million investment of our American Rescue Plan Act funds in affordable housing. Pretty exciting, real important in this advocacy work. I would just note that our state housing finance agency, the Nevada Housing Division, was at the table for all the conversations to listen to the discussions like, oh, it should be home ownership, it should be land, it should be, new development, whatever that looked like. They heard all the discussions, all the different perspectives, because ultimately, in order to deploy $500 million through the Nevada Housing Division, we needed a partner that thought that they could do it and that it made sense and had the connections. And they did. So I would say, when people say what was one of the key things, well, I would say there's two. It was really a statewide group that came together for the solutions, partnered with our housing finance agency, listening and knowing that they could do it. And they are currently deploying those funds. So on screen here, you see how the money was essentially divided up of that $500 million. Those grant agreements are being signed now. We've had a couple groundbreakings. I actually just went to a groundbreaking about a month ago with our one tribal project that received an award, the Washoe Housing Authority. So it's pretty amazing times. If you saw the New York Times article last week about the challenges for affordable housing development with the increased finance rates for debt financing, you know that it's hard times around the country for affordable housing development, but not in Nevada. It is going like crazy right now. So we're excited. Of course, we have our state's greatest deficit. So now let me just give a quick update on the legislative session that we just came out of. As I mentioned, if we go to the next slide, Nevada meets every other year. And we have been so busy since the last session working in the interim. Well, we actually spent the first year of our interim doing the American Rescue Plan Act funds. And the second part, we said, oh my gosh, we have our session upon us. What does this look like for policies? So the Nevada Housing Coalition, we have a policy committee. And again, our audience really runs the gamut of the housing ecosystem, which has helped us build good policies. We tracked this session, and as I've talked to my other state partners, I heard the same thing, that housing is a big deal, right? Housing is everybody's concern, and affordability of our housing is a huge concern, and our lack of affordability. Thanks to the NLIH research team, Andrew and Dan, we know that Nevada has our country's most severe shortage, actually, for our extremely low income renter households. So we have a lot of work to do. I'm not going to dive into the whys, very complex. But what I have on the screen here is our top 4 priorities, only one of which we had to take the super strong lead. 3 others came out of our policy work and policy forums. So really exciting. I'm not going to go into detail on these bills, but what I wanted to point out to this group is all 4 of our top priorities had overwhelming bipartisan support. So as you look on your screen, Assembly Bill 213 was a bill brought by the builders who are big in our policy committee and really streamlining efforts. And within that bill to streamline just for our overall supply, right? For our middle income housing that also needs a boost. There were advantages for affordable housing in that bill as well, including prioritizing projects and additionally just getting a better understanding of our landscape. If you'll note in there, I just want to point out when you get the slides, it's incorrect. That bill there passed 39-3 in the Assembly and 18-2. But again, overwhelming bipartisan support. We closed a loophole for one of our state funding resources through the real property transfer tax. That was exciting, passed unanimously. By the way, those 2 bills are signed. And then Assembly Bill 62 also signed. And that one there modernizes our property tax exemption. Again, unanimous, signed, super exciting. 3 out of our 4 are signed. The 4th bill, and I brought my board member and subject matter expert and human extraordinaire to this conversation to help share information about it. But Assembly Bill 310 was amazing. This bill passed both houses nearly unanimous. In the Senate, we had 1 no vote, and it's currently on the governor's desk right now. So Governor Lombardo, we're so excited for you to sign this bill. But this bill for this audience, we wanted to talk about because this bill is really the housing solution to end homelessness. It is Nevada's opportunity to actually build supportive housing. We have some supportive housing happening in our state, but not enough. And certainly not strategic. And we don't have any dedicated resources for it. So the Supportive Housing Development Fund in Assembly Bill 310 was incredible. We did a lot of work this last year. It was amazing, all the meetings and outreach we did. In the end, this bill had 130 signers for a letter of support. And we also had support from our tenant advocate groups to our realtors, builders, resort association, developers, really across the board, chambers. It was incredible. And in fact, because of this work that we did on Assembly Bill 310, we were also able to pivot. And for those of you that are familiar with the Oakland A's and the stadium bill that was recently passed in Nevada, don't ask me about the whole bill. I was very focused on one section. There was one section of the bill that was directing some waterfall funding ultimately to homeless services in Clark County. And not because we don't need homeless services, but in session, we had just passed $100 million of general funds for a homeless initiative in Clark County, another win. But what we don't have is dedicated funding for supportive housing and housing below and housing for households below 30% area median income. So what the coalition was able to do was work with the majority leader and speaker to revise that language last minute. That day that it passed the assembly was the day that we were working very closely with leadership to align the language in that bill to match Assembly Bill 310's language, and also to direct those funds to an amazing resource, which is the Clark County Community Housing Fund, so that they could do the work there for housing for our unhoused neighbors. So with that, I'd love for us to talk about Assembly Bill 310. And so Brooke, I am going to turn it over to you.
Great.
And next slide.
Yes, thank you so much, Christine. Hello, everyone. As Christine mentioned, my name is Brooke Page. I am a board member with the Nevada Housing Coalition, but I'm also the director for the Southwest Geography for the Corporation for Supportive Housing, or CSH. And we worked in partnership with the coalition, along with Assemblywoman Danielle Monroe-Moreno, to develop this really important policy called the Nevada Supportive Housing Development Fund, or AB 310. And just some structure, and thank you so much for putting in the chat, Christine. We've got a 2-pager that outlines what we're talking about today, but I wanted to highlight some of the high key points of this policy. And so what this does is it provides the infrastructure in Nevada for the first time that we have codified in statute to really help with the development of the affordable housing with the wraparound supportive services that we know evidence shows supportive housing is really the most cost-effective intervention to really help address our homelessness issue. That's been proven, and there's a lot of evaluation around supportive housing. And so we have an opportunity to really create this infrastructure where we are developing a grant program with the fund, and it will live with the Nevada Housing Division, with our experts there who already administer so many of our affordable housing tools. This will be an additional grant program that they can now work with our developers who are wanting to develop supportive housing, but for the service resources, they may not have a lot of the three legs of the stool. We know they need capital, they need operating. This provides also the services that they need to develop those really important supportive housing units that are needed. So this creates that program. It provides the opportunity to work in collaboration with our interagency council on homelessness to housing that will work with our Nevada Housing Division and help review grant proposals that come in and really come up with a really comprehensive strategy to make sure that we're funding projects that are meeting the need for our entire state. This is a statewide program, and it will also work in collaboration with people with lived experience and our housing providers and service providers, so they have also a stake in the decisions that are being made with this fund. We also are excited about this fund because for sustainability purposes, it will also be able to receive funding from other funding sources. So part of the policy, we're asking for a one-shot appropriation of $32 million from the legislature. And we also will have an opportunity to receive funding sources from other places, like our philanthropy sponsors or corporate sponsors and donors who can also contribute to this fund to help it with ongoing sustainability. So on the next slide, we provide just kind of an overview of what this $32 million will help seed and kind of plant the seed for us in Nevada. And what it does is, one, it will provide that full package to our affordable housing developers so they have the resources for service funding, either to provide tenancy support services on site for people who need that level of service. We're hoping to see like 1 to 20 caseload size ratios in housing for folks that really need that level of housing support. We also are looking to see outreach and engagement to get people out of emergency systems and into permanent housing solutions. And we also have recognized that operating may be a gap. And so there's resources here to actually support to keep rents affordable for folks so they can sustain and maintain their housing. Another important feature of this bill is it provides the capacity building to help with the infrastructure to provide supportive housing at a quality standard. So we're going to be training and working with our developers, our service providers, and our property managers to work together to implement quality supportive housing so we can achieve those outcomes that we know that supportive housing provides when it's done at quality standards. And then we're going to be tracking this program. And so there'll be resources here to do an evaluation so we can track who is getting housed, who is getting access to resources throughout the state, and how this program is being administered, because we recognize that accountability to the governor, to our interagency council is important. So they recognize that this program is operating and doing well. So that's kind of what this program does. We're really excited about it. And I know in the interest of time, we'll open it up for questions, but wanted to just give a highlight and a shout out to AB 310.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much for this excellent presentation and also the really wonderful work that you're doing in Nevada. We know from, NLHC's Out of Reach report that Nevada has some of the most severe housing needs in the country. And so, seeing all of your cross collaboration with, different sectors in order to make the point that this funding is desperately needed is so inspirational. We love to see it. So one question I did have for you all, you mentioned partnering with housing advocates from really across the spectrum of affordable housing advocacy, as well as advocates from other sectors like healthcare. Could you talk a little bit about how you formed those cross-sector partnerships and how those partners can help make the case for affordable housing investments at the state level?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And the one benefit to the development of this policy was the recognition that we wanted to make sure that the Interagency Council on Homelessness to Housing was a part of this process, because they already have in statute a very robust group that meets regularly and at least monthly, and they come together to talk about homeless and housing issues across the state. And that body is made up of folks from our Department of Health and Human Services, our housing division, our justice system, our Medicaid partners, as well as our homeless response continuum of care partners, are all already have a seat at the table, as well as the voices of people with lived experience. So we recognize that because this table was already set, we didn't need to reinvent the wheel. And so we leveraged that body and ensured that they were a part of this process to help determine how these grants were being administered.
Yeah, and I would just add, Brooke, if I may, Kim, too, that the coalition is able to tap its members, right? So even the coalition board, we have one of our major MCOs, one of our major Medicaid providers, Anthem, represented on the board of directors. And our policy committee, that list of stakeholders that I named, they're represented in our policy committee, right? So they are giving input also early, often. They're not shy, and we take it to heart.
That's fantastic. And I hear in that too, just like the real importance of genuine collaboration, not just coming to somebody when a bill is done and saying like, hey, will you advocate for this? But engaging them from the beginning and making sure that their voices are heard and ideas reflected in what comes together.
So true.
That is fantastic work. Thank you so much for sharing, both of you. There were a couple questions in the chat that Christine answered while Brooke was talking, but just to flag a couple questions about the per unit housing cost and how reasonable it is. And Christine, I don't know if you wanted to add any more to your response to that.
No, I would say David had asked about, and I think looking at the HMNI, the Home Means Nevada numbers, the ARPA funds, those funds were mostly used as leverage, right? And so they really played into our capital stack. And so really what we're seeing are costs that are pretty in line with most LIHTC development. Now the AMI percentages are a little lower that are accountable to those ARPA funds because of the ARPA requirements by US Treasury, but no, pretty much in line. And then I had answered a question also about the services and how we're funding the Supportive Housing Development Fund, which is one-shot funding. But we're confident that we will prove the case in the cost avoidance, because we've seen great programs in Denver and in Arizona that are showing our elected officials that we need to invest in housing. So, you know, crisis intervention is really important in the services that are provided, but where are our unhoused neighbors going to live? We must invest in the housing so that they have housing to live in.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Well, thank you all so much, and congratulations on your incredible victories in the Nevada State Legislature. Yes. It was an absolute delight to have you all on and to hear all of that good news. We love good news every now and then. So thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. And so before we close out the call, I wanted to provide a policy update on the FY24 appropriations process. To provide a quick recap on what's happened over the last couple of weeks, House Republicans and the Biden administration reached an agreement on a deal to lift the federal debt ceiling until 2025 in exchange for capping FY24 spending at FY23 levels and for allowing only a 1% increase to federal spending in 2025. So those are obviously some pretty austere caps on HUD programs that would be really disastrous. Because the cost of housing and homelessness services rise every year, HUD needs increased funding annually in order to just maintain the number of people being served and the number of programs being offered. Those cuts, however, were still not steep enough for members of the far-right House Freedom Caucus, who were miffed by the debt ceiling deal and demanded House appropriators mark up FY24 spending levels to FY22 levels. House Speaker McCarthy and House Appropriations Chair Kate Granger caved to that demand and agreed to propose an over 25% cut to the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Bill, which provides funding for HUD's vital programs. That would be a cut of over $22 billion at a time when HUD is already facing a $15 billion deficit from FY23 due to the increased cost of rent, as we talked about earlier on the call, and decreased receipts from the Federal Housing Administration, which typically help provide a little bit of cushion to HUD's budget. In the Senate, Chair Murray and Vice Chair Collins are working together to mark up their FY24 spending bills to the levels agreed upon in the debt ceiling deal. Without strong advocacy, though, it is very likely that we will see some significant cuts to HUD's budget, including potentially over 1 million people who currently receive rental assistance, losing the funding that they rely on to keep a roof over their heads. And we have yet to see a draft THUD bill from the House, but we do know that the numbers are going to be bad. If House Republicans get their way, we could see some of the most significant and draconian cuts to HUD's budget in the department's history, so much so that, according to a letter from HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge to Appropriations Ranking Member Rosa DeLauro, if these cuts were implemented, it would make it impossible for HUD to stave off mass evictions. These cuts are coming at a time when our nation's affordable housing stock is continuing to deteriorate. There are more people than ever, more families than ever, sleeping unsheltered on the streets. And when the cost of rent, as we covered earlier, has increased dramatically. And to put a little cherry on top of everything, after throwing a fit over the federal debt, House Republicans introduced last week a tax bill that would only add to the deficit by making permanent tax cuts to the highest income earners and corporations. And if that doesn't make you mad, then I don't know what will. It is deeply unserious to demand people with the lowest incomes bear fiscal responsibility for the national debt. We cannot balance the federal budget on the backs of people who rely on assistance to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. With all of that being said, this fight is not over. In fact, it is far from over. It is just the beginning. Your advocacy is needed more than ever. I don't know what we're on. If I could get the slides to advance just a couple. And one more, perfect. So that is a QR code to our Take Action page. If you pull up your phone, you can scan it. It will take you right to our Take Action page where you can weigh in with Congress about the urgent necessity of increased funding for HUD's programs, about the dangers of enacting these draconian cuts. What would these cuts mean to your families, to your community, to your neighbors? How would your community absorb the loss of such a drastic funding? How would people be impacted by this, right? Make this real for your legislators. Make them know what the very real human cost of their decisions will be. So this, like I said, it's just the beginning. We are looking at a very long-term fight for increased appropriations in the year ahead. Congress technically has until October 1st to enact a new budget. What will likely happen is that we will see some continuing resolutions that actually take us into December for a final budget. And December is 6 months away, but that will come and go fast. And we need to be doing the advocacy and the work now. There is still the possibility of seeing a supplemental funding package that will help add a little bit of extra cushion to these really drastic cuts that we are seeing proposed to the FY24 spending bill. And so in addition to pushing Congress not to enact these drastic cuts, we should also be pushing Congress to provide that supplemental funding through a supplemental appropriations package to make sure that no one loses access to the assistance they rely on to keep a roof over their heads, to make sure that people experiencing homelessness are still able to receive the support and services that they need to find safe, stable housing, and to ensure that communities are still able to make the needed changes and repairs to existing affordable housing stock to make sure that it is not falling into disrepair. So NLHC has some priorities for the FY24 appropriations process, namely ensuring that every single voucher, whether project or tenant-based, receives renewed funding in order to make sure no one loses their rental assistance. Increased funding to HUD's homeless assistance grants so that people can continue to receive needed services. Increased funding for HUD's Native Housing Block Grant Program, which provides, which is one of the biggest sources of funding for affordable housing in Native communities, which have some of the most urgent affordable housing needs in the country. Funding for a permanent emergency rental assistance program that Andrew mentioned earlier as a key tool to addressing the affordable housing crisis and staving off evictions. And $300 million for legal assistance to prevent evictions, to ensure that anyone facing eviction is able to receive the legal assistance they need to retain stable housing. So that is our big ask for the week. I'm a little bit at a loss for words. Just the fact of what's being proposed and the very real experience of housing instability and homelessness that so many people in this country are going through. It's really unfathomable and extremely cruel to think that these vital resources that ensure people have safe, stable housing would be ripped away at a time like this, anytime, but especially right now. So thank you all. That is my call to action for today and for this week, I guess, because that brings us to the end of our call, and I don't see any questions popping up in the chat. But please do take action with NLHC and with all of our colleagues. Thank you so much for your for all of your advocacy. Oh, and I did just want to drop in the chat as well, just an article from our memo to members that went out today that really kind of breaks down what's going on with the appropriations process and what it looks like and the implications for HUD programs. Cool. So with all that being said, thank you all so much for joining us again this week. We will be back on July 17th with another HoUSed national call. And until then, please take care, weigh in with your members of Congress. Thank you so much for your advocacy, and we will see you soon. Thanks again.